All right, so we're going to begin our second panel. Let me just mention to the panelists and discussants, so please, I will have these cards down here, keeping you on time. And the webcasting people tell me it will look better to the world if you stand up at the podium, but I leave that choice to you, whether you in fact sit or stand at the podium. For everybody's benefit, we will be going in the order they are here. We are not going to be following the tyranny of alphabetical order. I am actually, as a B, a big fan of alphabetical order myself, but this is one situation where I think it makes more sense thematically to go in this order. So without any further ado, Allan, take it away.
Thanks, Stuart. My name's Allan Ingram. I'm an economist at a consulting firm called Economists, Inc., right here in D.C. I advised AT&T in a number of auctions, one including the incentive auction. Don't ask me any questions. I can't answer them. What I want to do before kicking off, one of the purposes of this panel is to talk about the implementation of auctions in general. And before getting into that, and before getting into any alterations that could have occurred with the incentive auction, I do want to say, I do believe this, if you were to run this auction 1,000 times with different rules, different opening clearing targets, different activity rules, a reserve, not a reserve, different eligibility point structure, different geographic licenses, you would probably get about the same result. The revenues would be about the same. Some of the distributions of licenses would be different. Maybe T-Mobile wouldn't have an extra 2x5 in LA. Who knows? But the overall result would be about the same. If anyone thinks that they can run that simulation, go right ahead. I guarantee you it will yield nothing. That said, I do think that there's, at least in my mind, one thing that the FCC or anyone contemplating a two-sided auction should consider in the future, and that's based on an issue that we've started to get into already, and it's the interaction between supply and demand in the two-sided auction. So the way this works is that in the two-sided auction that the FCC set up, you have a series of one-sided auctions. And in a one-sided auction, you start with a fixed supply, you start with prices low, there's excess demand, price rises until quantity demanded equals quantity supplied and the market clears. In the two-sided auction, you begin with an initial clearing target, you begin with an initial quantity supplied, you have excess demand, that market clears, and then there's either success or failure based on revenues. If there's failure, you pass things off to another supply. So there's this iteration of a series of separate one-sided auctions, or at least that's a simplified way in which you could conceive of it. What's key in that is excess demand. If you start a stage without excess demand, the stage will fail. And so that's just one idea that I want to impress upon everyone before getting into one tweak that we could do to the way a two-sided auction is constructed. So that issue here, as it manifested itself in the incentive auction, was increasing supply, or increasing supply in at least some markets. Because of Channel 37, because of Los Angeles, San Diego, the daisy chain in the Northeast Corridor, we did see markets with increasing supply. What that resulted in was excess demand that was between, depending on how you calculate it, was between 56% and 58% of what it could have been at the beginning of stages 2, 3, and 4 of the forward auction. So when you're looking at this in stage 2, before it even starts, you're basically saying this stage has very little chance of success simply because of the increase in supply. On the demand side, there's something very keen that the FCC has been doing for decades to try to get out of these problems, to try to form a good demand curve, and that's the activity rule. They require bidders to put a lot of their chips on the table early on, and then as prices go up, they gradually ratchet down their demand curves, and they require you to be active on a certain amount of those demand chips early in the auction. Okay, so we really don't have any huge abnormalities in the demand curve as we see it in one of these auctions. But if we get one of these LA problems, we can see it on the supply side. And so if there are any remedies that you can use to try to alleviate that, all the better. Okay. So one question, when could this occur? Well, in the incentive auction, it occurred, we had a geographic product space, we had a daisy chain effect, we had the border problem, more populated geographic areas have more demand units. All of those things together really created the problem. In a general sense, what this all means, you've got some externalities that exist between the suppliers that are creating that supply curve. So if I were looking to run a general two-sided auction, that's one thing that I would look for. A criticism of this is that someone might look at this and say, well, anyone who was going to bid in this auction knew about Channel 37. They knew about that impairment. They knew that, given what we opened with in Los Angeles and San Diego, that demand was that supply was probably going to increase in stage 2 and into stage 3. So what's the big deal? Everyone knew about it. Everyone expected it. Well, that's all well and good. You may believe that it's going to occur with a certain probability, but you don't know how your competitors are going to react to it if you're on the demand side of the issue. That, to me, is a problem, because at the end of the day, in a two-sided auction, you're trying to get interaction between demand and supply, and anything that you can do to improve certainty or lower risk of bidders who are participating in one of these things can help. Second, is this really a problem that you want bidders in the forward auction worrying about? You're trying to lower participation costs to get bidders at the margin into your auctions to make them more competitive, to raise more revenues. Is this something that if you can alleviate the problem, wouldn't it be better to do that rather than have them worrying about it on their own? So that's the issue. As one issue as I see it with the incentive auction. Is there a reasonably costly solution to alleviate this? Well, yeah, just run the reverse auction first, or at least run multiple stages of it first. See what you've got, see what the supply curve looks like. If you don't like the way it starts at the beginning, then maybe you've got the ability, I know the FCC may not have had the ability here to start at a lower clearing target, but at least consider it. Then, whether that could improve the auction, well, I'd say at minimum, an improvement that could occur in that auction were you to run the reverse auction first is that you wouldn't have a whole series in the forward auction of just one round of bidding, failed stage, and then we have to wait a month for the next stage of the forward auction. We've got the data from the reverse auction done. Yeah, if we see this problem coming and we suspect that there may be some very short stages in the forward auction, well, then we can just move the forward auction along so there isn't this whole start-stop structure to the auction. That, at minimum, I think would be an improvement. So that said, that's all I really have to say about specifics of the incentive auction. In general, one of the things that we're asked to do is consider FCC Spectrum Auctions in the future. And I'm a little biased on this and a little torn on it. I advise bidders in Spectrum Auctions and other auctions too, but in Spectrum Auctions, I'm more likely to get a client the more complicated an auction is. But I gotta tell you, when I advise bidders in another country, and I tell them the way the FCC runs things with all these tiny little geographic licenses, they look at me like I am from Mars. They have no idea why we do it this way. And then I explain to them, well, we've got small regional carriers, and there are customers who buy spectrum from small regional carriers. And that's a good thing, and the FCC has to do something about that. And then we've got speculators, and speculators can provide liquidity to a market, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. At the same time, structuring an auction where you are catering entirely to small bidders and entirely to speculators with a geographic license structure is not necessarily the best way to go about it. So I think at bare minimum, the FCC has to, in its future auctions, and it's one thing if it's a re-auction, you're tied into what you already did in the past. But for new bands, the FCC has to really reconsider geographic licensing, at least for a portion of the spectrum that's let at auction. Another thing that goes along with that, if you have these tiny geographic licenses, is it really a good thing to allow bidders to submit bids for the entirety of spectrum within a geography? I don't know if that's the case. I don't. If it's a good thing, I don't know whether it's a bad thing. It can be a good thing because it allows bidder flexibility. But the reason why it might be a good thing in the US is because we have already tied the auction to these tiny little geographic licenses, and so you need to provide bidders flexibility to substitute between blocks and across geographies. So alleviating those complications, it seems to me, may be a good thing.
About a minute and a half.
Okay, great. So finally, another question that Stuart asked us to consider is where we might see a two-sided auction in the future, or where might we like to see it. It's not going to happen, at least when I would like to happen, which is within the next 8 years. But I think it would be really cool to consider a two-sided auction where college applicants and universities are interacting in a manner where the bidders, which in this case are prospective freshmen and their parents, are considering financial aid decisions at alternate universities and can put in individual preferences that they may have financially for their alternate universities, and then weight those decisions in a cleaner manner than what occurs now. Like I said, it's not going to happen within the time period when I'd like it to happen, which is when my kid turns 18. But I think that would be a really neat place to see a two-sided auction.
The alternative is to do more consulting for AT&T and not be on
All right. And you finished in time. Even with the joke, we finished in time. All right, David.
They're first-degree price discriminators. It doesn't matter.
David, take it away.
Okay, thank you. So I'm David Salant. I teach at Toulouse School of Economics part-time. I'm co-founder of Auction Technologies. I, along with Mike and FTI Consulting, advised Comcast during this auction. And anything I say has potentially nothing to do with Comcast views, okay? Normal disclaimer. I'd like to thank Stuart. It's a great conference. And what I'm probably going to say, some of it's going to be a little bit saying what improvements could be made. So this is not a perfect auction. I think Gary and the team of the FCC did an amazing job. It's a very difficult process to manage all the constraints. And perfect's the enemy of the good is an old saying I've heard. Okay. And then one other comment about auction length. So a little over 20 years ago, like 22 years ago, I was helping organize a conference nearby with some other people here for a once-in-a-lifetime auction. That also took a long time. And people asked me how long an auction could take. And I said, well, during my first auction, I had 3 kids. And they were born December 30th, 1994, all 3 of them. They're triplets. And I've been milking that joke for 20 years. Anyway, so yeah, I will mention some ideas for speeding this up and what proceeds. So at a high level, what worked well? Basically they took 84 megahertz. The FCC got 84 megahertz of TV spectrum, which whatever measure you use wasn't worth as much as the mobile operators were willing to pay in a down market for spectrum for it, right? So even at low prices relative to AWS3 prices a few years ago, and I don't like to use revenues as a judgment of success, they repurposed a lot of spectrum, and $7 billion, at least in my neighborhood, is still a lot of money. And so that's probably not so bad either. And at the time, going into the auction, the way the market is today is there are two relatively strong MNOs that had relatively thick holdings of low-band spectrum. One can argue about the importance of low-band versus high-band, but one and perhaps both those, the number 3 and 4, needed or said they needed, or at least one of them said they needed low-band spectrum. And arguably, they came out of that auction with a much better portfolio of spectrum holdings than they had before the auction started. So that's probably a big success, right? I mean, from a policy perspective, repurposing, doing something quite new. Those are A grades. Those are high grades. In France, they give them 18, 20. They don't give 20s very often. It's a 1 to 20 scale. What didn't work so well is I think the provisions for reserves were less than ideal. Before, 3-4 years ago, arguably you had 4 competitors, and one of the smaller competitors didn't show up. They have financial problems, which may have been a factor. And full disclosure, I did advise Sprint for a while before they decided to pull out. And so it's not so clear whether you're going to have 4 viable mobile operators 2, 3, 4 years from now in the U.S., even absent merger. So that was not an overwhelming success if you wanted to preserve competition or the competitive structure, which is not clear that was a policy decision. They seem to want to split the baby, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So the complexity was pretty high, and I can tell you, I could spend an hour just explaining the extended round, which nobody's mentioned here before. But that we had to spend weeks just to explain to our executives, they might have to increase their bids on everything they're bidding on in one round by 25% in order to hold all their points to keep the option for buying the same package the next stage. And when you're 15% below what you might have targeted as your budget, what you want to spend, the idea of increasing all your bids 25% and not knowing whether you're going to have to pay 5% more, 23% more is not something such an easy decision for even a big company with adequate, ample credit rating, okay? So that was not the easiest thing in the world. The LA San Diego, they was discussed before the auction duration. I'll say something more. And on the forwards, very often in SMR auctions and clock auctions, you might get a bigger license selling for less than a small license. You get price anomalies. That didn't happen so much in the forward side of this auction. It did happen a bit in the reverse side. So like Harrisburg TV stations basically got pretty close to the same price as Philadelphia TV stations. They're all quite different. So, you're comparing Apple, Macintosh apples with delicious apples. They're not exactly the same, right? So it's not exactly apples to apples comparison, but those prices are very hard to justify. Still trying to figure out exactly why that happened, and I'll show you an example in a second. I want to talk, and I know Stuart didn't want anybody talking, okay, thanks, having heated debates about spectrum reserves and spectrum caps. So I'm not going to try to debate and take a position other than I don't think the reserve provision worked very well. As Mike pointed out, there was almost no difference. And indeed, more granularly, roughly in 80 markets where there's a price difference, I think that's right, there were, the reserve was a little less, but in 40 the reserve was a little more than the non-reserve. The average is about just a shade over 1% difference. Most of the markets, there's no difference whatsoever. On the other hand, if Comcast or Dish wants to, Dish has 4 blocks in New York, they want to sell a block to, say, Verizon or AT&T, they may have to wait 6 years. And that's less than ideal because they got a little bit more than they may have targeted. At least their bidding indicates that. So I don't think those provisions work very well. And there's been an argument made that, well, everybody should pay the fair price. You shouldn't let T-Mobile or Sprint or Dish get away with paying 30% less than AT&T and Verizon. I can understand that. On the other hand, if you want to favor competitors and you want provisions in the auction to favor more competitors in the market afterwards, then you're going to have to acknowledge you want to let them have a discount. Maybe that's not the right way to do it, but putting these aftermarket restrictions on and these reserve things didn't seem the way to do it. There should be an active policy discussion that has more analysis about what the pros and cons are and make that determination up front. Also, I think, in fact, the reserve was triggered very late. It was basically triggered in a few rounds in stage 4. Once you got through the first stage without the reserve, there's a pretty good chance there was going to be very little price difference. Thank you. I'm just going to plug a paper. I've been working on a more theoretical, complete analysis of this, talking first principles, not sponsored by anybody. Totally, this is what I do in my spare time when I don't do consulting on auctions. Okay. But there's a number of useful papers on this, some from the energy sector where they have run two-sided auctions too. The bidding complexity, I only have a couple minutes. There are lots of little things in the rules that were very hard to process. We had to select price points for maybe 200 bids in a round. There's potential inadvertent loss of activity, so you might want to keep 200,000 bidding units of activity, but the way your bids are processed, you could lose 50 or 100,000 even though you didn't want to. I think in that case there were simple fixes, but Larry might disagree, but that's a different issue. I know they might add to the complexity. Add complexity in one hand and decrease it in other ways. I really didn't. I took exception to the assignment round. Again, that there are, in some sense, the FCC was sort of stuck when they went to 416 regions. You wanted a fast auction. I tend to favor concrete blocks rather than generic blocks, but I will be quick to acknowledge that having 416 times 10 concrete blocks does add some to complexity. I'm not sure. There are auctions that have had 2,000 different types of blocks. Okay, I'm really running out of time. I just want to show one thing here. The Chicago TV station WTO got its starting price. These other stations that were better had bigger volume in Chicago. This was southwest of Chicago, about 20 miles southwest. They got 26% of their starting price. So these more valuable UHF stations got a lot less percentage-wise in absolute terms than the VHF station that got the starting price. That's clearly something that, if you own one of those Chicago stations, you might, UHF stations, you might say, how the heck did these guys get so much? That's not very fair. Anyway, that's basically what I had to say. Thank you.
Great. So before I do want to say, I'm actually happy to anybody talk about anything they think will recur in a future auction. I only meant I don't want to focus on things that are highly specific, but spectrum reserves will come out in a future auction. Don't feel like you can't talk about them. Greg.
Hi, I'm Greg Rosston. I'm the economist from Stanford here who doesn't have a Russian accent. But I did work with Andy Skripich, who has a Polish accent, so, and I think, so these are thoughts that he and I have together, but I'm the only one saying them and the only one here to defend these things. So first, I want to echo a lot of the compliments to the FCC. I was at the FCC for the first Spectrum auctions with Jonathan Cohen and others here, and remember that that was an incredible team effort. There were so many people who were involved, from lawyers to engineers to economists, getting everyone involved. And I'm going to reflect what Carla said, that this is the first lesson that I learned from, actually from when I was a graduate student before auctions. I went and spent a week at the FCC, and Evan was great. And he, his daughter is getting married tomorrow, so that's why he's not here. But he cares deeply about this. What he did was he, in the first auction, if people know this, he wrote a lot of the NPRM on the first auction. And what he did was he put in a lot of footnotes to academic papers on auctions. And all of a sudden, people like Paul Milgram and Bob Wilson and Preston McAfee started getting telephone calls about consulting. And this is how we got there. But what he also did was he convinced the FCC to hire John McMillan to be the inside advisor to the FCC as an academic to push for auctions. And Reed Hunt deserves a lot of credit for pushing and believing in The Economist. We had a lot of heated discussions with Reed. There were some mistakes made, for example, the C block, but in general, the auction went off well, and it was because people listened to Evan, and Evan was dogged in his pursuit. If anyone knows Evan, he is like a dog with a bone. He will not let go. And so he told me this yesterday, that he wanted to hire Paul and Paul's team to get people on board, and he went to do this, and I hate John Leibovitz for calling it the incentive auction, because any economist knows every auction has incentives. But so that's why my title was the reallocation auction, not the incentive auction. But there was no authority for this two-sided auction. And so Evan got Paul hired to do an overlay license auction with a condition that it be the winner of the overlay hold a two-sided auction. So that's how he got this started. And he got Paul in early and got Paul tied up before any of the bidders could tie Paul up. And then Paul was smart and hired a whole bunch of really smart people, Larry and Ilya here, and got the whole team working together. And it was a team effort at the FCC, again, to do this. This is, this is a great conference to kind of go over what happened and what lessons there are for the future. We actually at CPER worked with Evan to hold an early conference on the auctions about what could be done and what should be done. And I think that, I hope that helped, since I was part of it. But I also think that I wish there could have been more interaction with the FCC team. We had, we had meetings as Andy and I, we studiously avoided any conversation with Paul and Ilya and John Levin at Stanford, except we had ex parte meetings where we would meet in a conference room and have a phone to the FCC and talk about it. But they were less than forthcoming, I would say. It was clear they were dying to speak, but they had less ideas, and it wasn't really a two-way structure. I think that the FCC, somehow to try to figure out a way where they could be, could talk more and have more give and take in a setting that is brings in more people would help the auction. So that's a lesson that I had from the process. I think they did a great job. There were things that that might have been better had there been an additional conference halfway through. But you have the problem that then people are tied to what their clients want, which is a difficult piece. So the goal of the auction should be to maximize social welfare, not maximize revenue. The revenue to the Treasury should not be considered. The revenue in this case was a consideration because we had to pay the broadcasters. There was a revenue constraint that there hasn't been in past auctions. One of the ways to maximize social welfare again is to listen to Evan Correll. So on my talk, I want to talk two subjects today about auction structure and the ability of auctions to incorporate other goals than revenue. So I don't see Tom Haslett. Is he here? Oh, you are there. Okay, good, Tom. I thought you were out signing copies of your book for people, for the adoring public.
He's a shadow of his former self.
Yes. So anyway, I warned Tom.
$25.99 on Amazon.
I got a note from. He's written a great book on Spectrum, and
Got it cheaper on Kindle.
they gave me a $3 discount even before I bought it, so I was really happy about that. So Tom has long advocated overlay licenses for this, and we should have done overlay licenses. And he put forth a paper, and he had the guts to put this down and come up with an idea of here's how we're going to do an overlay license. An overlay license would have given somebody the rights to, for example, channel 45 to 51, 42 megahertz of spectrum, and they could then negotiate with the broadcasters in channels 45 to 51, and even negotiate with the channels 42, 43, 44 to get them out of the band and clear the band. And this would have been Preston's 30 days. I think Tom believes it would have taken a little bit longer than that. So this is an example of the overlay license idea, and that would have been something that wouldn't have required congressional legislation. It wouldn't have required a complex two-sided auction. It wouldn't have required this huge team. We could have done a simple standard SMR auction and gotten this over with. And we would have had overlay licenses over the whole television band, from, as you can see, from channels 2 to channel 51. So this is, I think, the FCC's was a centralized market. The first benefit of this was it kind of forced all the TV stations to kind of go back and reevaluate how much is my business really worth, and how much it kind of figured out a little bit of a mechanism to get people to solve some of the principal agent problem between shareholders and management. This COAS world without transactions costs would have been great. If we could have somehow figured out a way to reallocate this stuff from the market, it would be great. But COAS was very careful and said without transactions costs. There would be a lot of transactions costs to get 70 megahertz cleared even. So I would argue that the FCC's auction set a lower bound for the number of transactions. There were 145 stations that sold out for $8.8 billion, 30 that moved for $1.2 billion, and 1,049 stations that had to move without any premium compensation. This was, I believe, what Carlos talked about, Evan's point that we can, and Elia's point, we don't have this single station blocking, but in the case here, we have lots of single stations that might block. But we were able to move them without premium compensation. We were able to pay their expenses and get them to move out. This is, if you think about this, there were 521 stations in the 84 megahertz. If you had those top two licenses in the overlay, you would have had, and you wanted to clear the stations, you would have had to negotiate with 521 stations if you had bought those two licenses. And that was your only thing. You were the overlay license winner. You didn't have the authority to force people to move. You would have had to have 521 stations say, yes, I'll agree to sell, okay? And as we've seen, there were some hedge funds and other people who were very smart and bought television stations and savvy negotiators. If we'd had the overlay license, they might have done the same thing. I don't know. If you really wanted to think about, well, if I can get a channel in the top stations to move to a lower channel, I can negotiate with a lower channel and that. I might have to really come to the complete set of negotiations. I'd have to negotiate with over 2,000 stations, okay? Right now, we have 466 stations who are subject to being repacking, okay? That's a lot that are not in the licensed in the new 84 megahertz band. And this is how we got it for a relatively small amount of money compared to what they're. So of the 445 that are going off the air, $4.5 billion is going to the 80 people in that band, but $4.5 billion is going to people not in the 84. So if you think you could have cleared 84, you would have still had to pay off a lot of people, or you would have had to pay the people in the 84 megahertz. Essentially what this says is the people in the 84 who are being involuntarily relocated would have required more than $4.5 billion, okay? Probably a lot more than $4.5 billion to get them to get out of that 84 megahertz, okay? So that means that the cost of clearing 84, if you were just doing it, would be a lot higher. This is just to show that where there are a lot of stations to be repacked. So the added issues on this are that you not only want to clear your 84, or if you had those two licenses, you still have to clear people below because their TV stations bleed into the 84 from below in terms of spectrum and also geographic adjacency issues. So there's a free rider problem if someone else has the license next to you, or right next to you in spectrum or geography, and you have to figure out this free rider problem. We've done that to some extent, and I always say there are okay. So a way to do this would be to have a single overlay license but that didn't get into the competition issues that I think were really important and the FCC's auction showed that competition issues can be incorporated into an auction process. Other social goals can be incorporated successfully. I disagree with David that I think it was successful in terms of bidders coming in thinking they had a chance at doing it. I think the fact that it didn't come up with a difference in price isn't a critical, or doesn't say that it was a failure. It says that people showed up and the people who were eligible got it. If in the end it was only AT&T that was not eligible and they were trying to exit anyway. So that's why we didn't get the differential, but it gave the bidders confidence to show up, and maybe bidders who came in, like Columbia Capital, might have had more incentive to come in if they thought they could win because there was a reserve available. I'm going to skip these two slides. So on the end, I think that we can, in the reserve, we can have a, it depends, whether we need it depends on the market. If there is a reserve in particular, you might think about how competitive the market is and what are the chances of foreclosure. You also want to think, but there may be other social goals you want, such as geographic coverage or other things that can be incorporated in an auction. How much more should you pay for someone who decides to, you can incorporate these. Leslie Marks has written a paper, it's a Duke site, so I'm, paying homage to the right.
Seconds.
Yeah, exactly. And then the fact that some of these are restricted and unrestricted licenses and sold for different prices, or sold for very similar prices, and there's a problem that some of the restricted licenses have some resale provisions that are restrictions. In some sense, that's a problem. You're selling the same thing for two different prices from an economics perspective. From a social policy perspective, this says, hey, only people who are serious about actually using the license, it gives them an incentive to actually bid rather than someone who wants to turn around and sell the license. 5 years in the context of trying to build a wireless system isn't a long time. So at least my client is, I think, serious about building a network and using the spectrum. I don't think they considered the fact that there was a restriction and that was a problem. So this is something that you might think about as how you use that. I think I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Preston, take it away.
Hi, I'm Preston Pate. I not only don't have a Russian accent, I'm not an economist. So I ended up here, I was minding my own business in the fall of 2012, teaching law school teaching communications law at the University of Colorado Law School. I got a call from a good friend who said, there's going to be this auction. The television broadcasting establishment is not very excited about it, but there are some station owners that would like to participate. They want to form a coalition to advocate for rules that would be favorable to stations seeking to sell. And it'd be a little part-time thing. It'd probably take a year and a half. And so I signed up, and here I am. The first thing I want to do, Evan Corral certainly is one of the fathers of this auction, but I want to mention one other, the former dean of the law school where I taught, Phil Weiser, who yesterday declared his candidacy to be the Attorney General of the state of Colorado. But in 2008, he wrote and delivered a paper at Brookings Institution basically laying out the framework for the structure of this auction to move spectrum from UHF TV to wireless. And then He ended up in the Obama White House as the technology and innovation advisor to the president and played a huge role in championing the passage of the statute that made this auction possible. So I wanted to mention his contributions. I want to join what everybody else has said about the unbelievable job done by the FCC, 4 different chairpersons, Gary, several bureau chiefs, and more than 100 dedicated staff. They took a bare statute with very little detail in it, and they turned it into a flawlessly executed auction. And as you can see there, Gary actually can walk on water. That's the Little Choptank River. Is it?
There's mud, but it's okay.
So how did we get here? We got here because the wireless industry said they had to have this spectrum, not just any spectrum. They had to have this spectrum. And these are quotes from the Wireless Association, CTIA, absolutely critical. We're going to die if we don't get this 600 megahertz spectrum that the broadcasters are sitting on. In February of 2011, CTIA said the carriers would bid as much as $48 billion for the spectrum. And so we got here because the wireless industry said they had to have this spectrum. And some of the biggest players in the wireless industry echoed that same argument for their specific companies. Here are quotes from FCC filings by Sprint, Verizon, and AT&T. They're all to the same effect. This 600 megahertz spectrum is essential. We've got to have it. We've got to have it. We've got to have it. Now, one complication is accommodating the wireless industry's claimed need for this spectrum required Congress to hurt and disadvantage another industry. To make this 600 megahertz spectrum available, 1,000 TV stations are going to be moved involuntarily. Now, imagine you're sitting running a TV station in, I don't care, pick a city, Detroit, anywhere, and you never wanted to sell your spectrum. All you wanted to do is continue your business. And now the government is telling you you have to change your channel, you'll have to get a new antenna, you're going to have to find a tower crew that can climb 2,000-foot towers, and there aren't very many of them. It's going to cost you a lot of money, and you never wanted any part of this. And I think you can make the case that if, in fact, all the leading wireless carriers were actually in desperate need of this spectrum, you can make a public policy argument that it's fair to disadvantage this TV station because all of these carriers absolutely have to have the spectrum. But when the auction began, these 3 companies, Verizon, AT&T, and Sprint, who had advocated so strongly that they had to have this spectrum, they didn't show up. It was like, oh, just kidding. And Verizon and Sprint didn't bid at all. AT&T, as we know, came in stage 1 and then shed demand as fast as the FCC rules would allow. Why? Well, we got the answer just last week from Verizon's chief network officer who said, quote, "We simply don't need it." She didn't say we didn't bid because it was a reserve or some complication in the rules. She just said we didn't need it. And so to me, the #1 takeaway from this auction is we have to find a way to never again let those claiming to need spectrum and disadvantage others then fail to show up for the auction. With all due respect to my economist friends, and I try very hard to understand some of what they say, just from a layman's standpoint, I think this auction was inefficient in 2 respects. First, we left 42 megahertz of pristine 600 megahertz spectrum on the table. Just this week, not 2011, not 2012, this week, CTIA filed comments with the FCC saying it's critical that the government provide more high medium, and low-band spectrum. And if that is in fact the case, it's an inefficiency of the auction design that we left 42 megahertz on the table. The other inefficiency I see is the auction failed to clear out a ton of very low-value marginal television stations that remain on the air, complicating the repacking process. And to my mind, an efficient auction would have cleared out these very low-value stations. I believe there may be some free market opportunities now that the auction is over to clear out some of those stations, but it's an inefficiency that they were left there. I also believe that the auction put too much power in the hands of individual forward auction bidders. By focusing on excess demand only in the top 40 markets and allowing bidders to express less than their full eligibility, a single forward auction bidder had the capacity, the ability to end a stage by simply hiding their demand in smaller markets. Conversely, one bidder could force a round to remain active by adding significant demand in just one top 40 market. You've heard a lot of talk about gaming the system. I think there was too much power in the hands of individual forward bidders. Also, the forward auction bidders were given stage price information before each round, and the broadcasters were not. So what are the lessons learned? I think there's four. Current spectrum holders need price guidance. I'm just going to jump right straight to the detail on these. For the people who hold the spectrum already need some price guidance to entice them into the auction. There was a lot of talk early on in this auction about whether there would be such price guidance, and fortunately there was. And from my perspective, the auction didn't become real in attracting a lot of interest throughout the broadcast industry until the Greenhill book came out. Spectrum holders also need options. You want to be able to say to them, look, we'd like you to put your spectrum in this auction, but that doesn't mean that you have to end your business or your activity. There's a way for you to continue your business or your activity even after you give up the spectrum. And workable channel sharing rules were an absolute key to broadcaster participation. 92% of the stations that left the auction without owning spectrum indicated they intend to channel share. And initially, the FCC had very restrictive channel sharing rules. Some of the members of our coalition came to it. They tried to enter into sharing arrangements. They came to us. They said these rules aren't workable. We filed a petition for reconsideration. We met with Gary, who put up with more meetings with us than anybody ever should have to do. And to his credit, he and the commission did change the sharing rules to provide for what we call nomadic licensees. You can give up your spectrum, but you're still an FCC licensee, and you can go be hosted on this station in town, and after 3 years, you can move over to this station in town. And if those nomadic licensees absolutely have to be transferable, it would be a cruel hoax on the broadcasters who relied on those to give up their spectrum if it were to turn out that they were not transferable. Contrary to what everybody else has said, I think the reserve was a mistake. These incentive auctions are complex enough. Adding the reserve added another whole level of complexity. And given the fact that the two companies everybody was worried about from a foreclosure standpoint didn't end up actually being interested in the spectrum at all for reasons that had nothing to do with the reserve, I think it was a mistake. It was also a mistake to include in the pricing for broadcasters the amount of population they cover. The only measure that made any sense for the value of these TV stations is their interference footprint, how much they contributed or did not contribute to clearing the spectrum. And as I said before, we got to make sure we have a way to make the bidders show up. And since technology does change over time, I want to echo what other people have said about the need to find a way to conduct these auctions more quickly, because I think that would help this problem of the bidders not showing up. Thank you.
All right, so next is Eddie, who is the only person on this panel who does not have slides and the only one who negotiated a $1 billion deal in the last 4 days. So,
Yes, I hate PowerPoint so much that I had to help work myself out of a job over the last month. So I come at this, I guess, from two perspectives. I was the chief of staff at the FCC from 2009 to 2012, which was a critical formational point for the incentive auction. But now I'm the general counsel and chief strategy officer of Tribune Media, which was a participant in the auction. And so I have two very different perspectives. I think I'd just like to start out by saying that the first lesson of this is that when government undertakes a really complicated but important thing, and it brings in fantastic people to do it, it can accomplish something amazing. And you know, people have talked about the success to various degrees of the auction, but I really think it's a much bigger point in the way we think about government today. There's a crisis of confidence in the ability of government writ large to undertake this kind of novel, innovative, complicated, you know, hard stuff and actually get it pretty much right. And I certainly agree with some of the criticisms that have been leveled. Others I either don't agree or don't understand, because I'm not an economist either. But I will say, I think if you just take a big step back, you have to really marvel at what happened here. Even if maybe it took too long, even if maybe it wasn't perfectly efficient, even if certainly from the broadcaster's perspective, there are lots of disappointments. It was an extraordinary thing, and the people involved in it should take you know, tremendous pride in what they were able to accomplish, and hopefully you know, other parts of government will be able to do similar things. I think maybe the second lesson from my perspective is timing is everything. When I was at the FCC, and certainly some of those CTIA quotes that Padden put up there from that era, you know, this low-band spectrum was the only game in town. It was the beachfront. It was, you know, every cliche under the sun, and it had to be repurposed. And I think that remained true through the auction, but to a lesser degree. Lots of things happened in between, and it wasn't because the auction went through 3 or 4 stages. It was because the run-up to the auction took a long time, and technology was changing very, very fast, and people became interested in other bands of spectrum. And so I guess if I were at the FCC, I might be asking myself, did I stage some of the big stuff around spectrum in the order that I should have staged it? And whether that's the FirstNet stuff or the freeing up of the high frequency bands for use. Did I take some of the pressure off of the people who might have high demand for the low band spectrum? And so I just think that's an overall question. We'll never know perfectly how it might have turned out on the demand side if things had been orchestrated a bit differently in terms of the building blocks of spectrum policy. But I think it's a question worth asking. In terms of thinking about the success, I guess the first thing you have to ask is what were the true goals? And others have touched on it, but I would just reemphasize that goal number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, and 10 was to move the spectrum from the broadcasters to a different use in mobile broadband. The discussion about money and how much deficit reduction was achieved by the auction, to me, is a very, very secondary consideration. The reason that auctions happen at the FCC is because they generate deficit reduction. And that's what spurs Congress to provide the kinds of authorizations that occurred here. And so for that reason, having meaningful deficit reduction attached to auctions is important because it's what actually gets you the next auction. But it's not, in my view, in a world of trillion-dollar deficits, a few billion here and a few billion there. And by the way, I really think you have to actually put the money from AWS and this auction together when you think about deficit reduction. When you do that, you hit some pretty big numbers. And so I think even recognizing that that was an extremely secondary consideration and really is more a congressional incentive than it is anything else, that was successful too. The one goal that wasn't in the auction at all, from my perspective, is to do anything positive for the broadcast industry. And I think that that's something, again, that if I were on the FCC staff, knowing what I do now and from the perspective perhaps that I have now, and again, I'm of course speaking for myself too, that's probably also something worth thinking about. The broadcast industry, I think generally is thought of as very static. It's viewed as a one-to-many inferior platform that doesn't serve as much social utility as broadband can. And one big question for the FCC coming up will be: is that changing? There is a new broadcast standard that's being rapidly developed, ATSC 3.0, that has a lot more flexible characteristics and can do a lot more things. And if you knew more about ATSC 3.0 when the auction was being designed, would you have built in a very different component to the repack? Would you have thought about compensating the broadcasters who wanted to stay in business differently? Would you have built a retrofit into the system and maybe not had such a distinct trade-off between the wireless industry and the broadcasters? One of the things that people have talked about in terms of the efficiency of the auction design and is that auction, you don't get your opening bid price when you go to auction. That's certainly true, but I don't think broadcasters really recognize the degree to which actually auction design isn't to get you your opening bid price or anything close to it. It's actually to get you to your lowest price that you'll accept. And I think that the designers of the auction knew that very, very well. But the way they presented the auction to the broadcasters was very, very different. And this is where probably Gary and I have the biggest disagreement. I do recognize the importance of the Greenhill reports, or the two Greenhill reports. But when you dangle in front of people many of whom aren't sophisticated, some of these are family businesses, or frankly, public television, which doesn't really even think in business terms, these enormous numbers, knowing that if your auction design works well, they're very, very unlikely to come to anything close to that unless they get really, really lucky like the Chicago station did. There's something about that just bumps up against my idea of good governance. You're allowed to say all kinds of things when you advertise that are technically true but misleading. You're not allowed to do that when you're a company. When government does that or comes close to doing that and is doing really a sale job to try and generate a demand on the selling side, it still sticks in my craw a little bit, and I'd just leave it at that. But I guess I would say on the broadcaster side, the failure to much earlier on embrace the inevitable, really dig in, create a uniform data set that all broadcasters could have had access to, have much better education around the auction, cost broadcasters a lot in the way they approach the auction. Preston's group should be commended because they did that work, and I think they were very, very sophisticated about it, very, very thoughtful. But I think the broadcasting industry writ large, with the exception of some companies that invested a lot of money on their own, didn't really come to understand the auction enough or quick enough. And I think that's frankly on us. Had we understood it better, I think our interaction with the agency would have been improved, and our ability to think about the auction for our own businesses would have been improved. That's I'll yield my extra 2 minutes to Gary.
Excellent, thanks. All right, Gary, you get the back clean up.
I agree with a lot of what the panelists said, and I agree with most of what Eddie said. I do differ a bit, and I think on the information that was put out. But I do agree on the point that the industry came a little bit late to informing its members about the opportunities for the auction. I'm 12 days retired, so I don't represent anybody. Thank you very much. But I do want, and I want to talk about the 5-year period when I was chair of the incentive auction, but I can't do that without recognizing the fact that a lot came before. You heard some of it today. You see Ruth Milkman and Eddie was involved, and Roger Sherman and Blair is here, for sure. These people laid the foundation. Even though we're talking about, the only thing I know about is those 5 years when I was there. We have one of the, clicker? We have one of the, we have the world's best experts here, but I want to take maybe a little bit more informal approach, and I want to do it for 3 reasons. When we today talked about coulda, shoulda, or will the next time, I want to give you a flavor of what actually happened and what it took to get to that point. And number 2, when people talk about the hundreds of people that are involved, I'd like to talk a little bit about what they did. They did a lot of good stuff. And third, if I ever get any chance to praise and sing the praises of the people who worked on this project, I will take it. And this is an opportunity to do so. We didn't talk about this, but this is an independent expert regulatory agency, and you have chairmen and chairs that are there. And unless you get their support, you got nothing. And there were 4 chairs that were involved in this particular auction, and they each were supportive and contributed to the overall result. Chairman Janikowski, as Eddie said, really set this thing on course and set this ship going and formed the task force and gave it its independence, something I'll come back to, which was absolutely crucial. Chair Clyburn was there for a short amount of time, but she really helped us break the logjam up in Canada. She helped the decision makers really embrace this. The staff at what's now the Industry Canada regulatory body has been great, but we had to approach this at the highest level. And Chairman Pai, many thanks and kudos to him for the brief period of time that I was there. He continued to support the auction, praised the staff, and has a dedication to get the repacking done. What's my point? The decision makers have to support it or it really doesn't work. On our first panel, you heard from our not really outside experts because they weren't really outside. We were lucky and smart to get them. They're opinionated, they had their different views, and sometimes with a little bit of urging from us came to a consensus. But they were always there, responsive, answered our questions, recognized the political realities, and knew that the commission was the ultimate decision maker. You know what? We had our own intellectual backbone of the commission. We brought our own operational experts. You've heard us sing the praises of Evan Correll, but the war room team headed by Melissa Dunford and Sasa Javid led the FCC task force effort. And if you are in the FCC auction business and do not know them, you should. On an implementation point, what was crucial, if you do not have a strong, no-nonsense, do it my way or the highway leader like Melissa, you're in trouble. And we needed it. We really needed that push to get stuff done. And if you do not have the combined auction experience and expertise of Margie Wiener and her team, you're not going to get it done. So that was also crucial. We were in that war room for a year and a day, from the time it went operational into the time it closed. They were more disciplined. I gained 5 pounds on the candy that was there. And you can see why. A really key point was, and why I consider the auction, of course, to have been a major policy success. So what we're discussing today, we'll discuss it for a long time. There'll be different views on that. But whatever your views, it was an operational success. It worked and worked well. We successfully ran a 2-sided auction. And really without formal declaration, what the task force was, I figured this out later, was an example of what's called matrix management. It's a way of managing cross-functional, cross-business group, and other forms of working that cross traditional vertical business units. The task force didn't exist on any organization chart anywhere. It was empowered by each chairman to operate independently and to operate at the bureau office level. You know, each of the people, I don't have time to go through them. Simon's, as usual, is drinking wine. But this was our front office of the task force, and it operated it as a team for the entire 5 years. Key was the fact that we had no silos. Again, this is a product of matrix management. We met almost weekly. There was a steering committee chaired by me. It worked because the chairman wanted it to work. You know, we've talked about today about Media Bureau and Wireless Bureau, but we didn't talk much about OET, Julie Knapp and his people, and we needed to figure out what to do about unlicensed mics, medical telemetry, TV study. That was really all in their bailiwick. Our IT interface, Jill Goldberger, it wouldn't have gotten done without her, and she's still working on the project. And the work of Bob Nelson and Ann Gallagher of the IB on Canada and Mexico was unbelievable. We have 84 megahertz worth of clear spectrum because we have deals with those two countries. We have the so-called LA and San Diego problem because we got spectrum from having a deal with Mexico as a result of it. It was good to get that spectrum. I'm going to take a couple of minutes on this slide, whatever remaining time I have. What am I talking about here? Okay, the top flow of the flow chart there is the upper level, very general systems and design. We've been talking today mostly about some of what's in the blue box, which we affectionately call RABs, FABs, and ARPs. Those are the auction bidding systems. But there are other boxes there. The orange boxes are the new IA-specific software that had to be designed, including TV study and including the optimizations that Carla talked about. Yellow and gray are legacy or modified legacy programs. The point is they all had to be designed, coded, tested, verified, and work together, and they did. The other boxes are two views of the public documents, and only the public documents adopted by the Commission from 2012 to 2017 to implement the incentive auction. It's a formal rulemaking. They had to go through rules. We had to have ex partes. The decisions had to be discussed, written, voted, and sometimes litigated. Here, thanks a lot to Bill Scher and Howard Simons in particular for work on those particular documents. And in the right-hand lower corner, for anybody who's interested, are the two Green Hill reports. Okay, the auction isn't over, and the auction is over, but the task force is not over. We do have a big job, and again, it's not only broadcasters. We've got low power and translator broadcasters, wireless, unlicensed mics, medical telemetry. They all have to fit together in the next stage of this offer. Of this project. The new effort is in the more than capable hands of my successor, Jean Cadieux, and her new deputy Hilary DeNegro. But the auction is over. I had the honor of bringing the final gavel down, and hopefully you'll now have a little bit better idea of what we meant when we said hundreds of people were working on the project. The auction is over. Whoops. Really.
All right, and everybody stated their time. So now we have time for questions. Anybody just you can get my attention, and then we'll get the we will get the mics. And if nobody has any questions, I'm happy to ask one. But I imagine
I can.
Please start us off.
Two things. I just want to correct the record. I thought the competition issue, the T-Mobile, it wasn't total failure. It was just the reserve didn't work all that well to attract all the entry and it put undue restrictions. So it was partial success. But on the overlay, Tom Haslett probably could say more than I can, but I remember working on the SMR auctions many years ago. That's specialized mobile radio, not simultaneous multiple round, so the acronyms can be confusing. These were a series of overlay auctions. And I did talk to some old Nextel guys who had the job of negotiating the contracts to buy out all the donut holes. And it's arguable how well that process worked, but there is a case for the FCC having done that. And, I think Greg makes some great points, but I think the case is not so clear.
So I wanted to, can I just
Please.
respond? First, I forgot to say that I work for T-Mobile in the auction, so I wanted to make sure that disclaimer was on the record. So second is, I actually had my notes talking about, if I'd had more time, I would have talked about the SMR overlay auction. And I think that that is a great example of one where you didn't have a lot of the same problems that were, that you had most of the license areas where a single licensee had most of the incumbents. They could work around the incumbents. Otherwise, they had so there were ways around this. You didn't have nearly the same holdout problems, and these were very different auctions in this case. So I think you need to look. I think overlays are important and quite possibly could be used for the next. If we want to go down below channel 37, overlays may be the right answer there. If rather than just letting them stand idle and not have the possibility of transition. So I do think overlays have a place. I just think here the complications were such that it made it much more difficult.
So I just wanted to reemphasize one point that Preston made a little bit on a separate topic, which is this notion of channel sharing. The reason I wanted to raise it is just that it's an innovation that is a totally new idea, and based on the very robust after-auction channel share market that Preston mentioned, hugely successful. And I think that's another innovation that people should take away. And I don't know if their lessons may not be directly applicable, but this notion of being able to basically start a process moving with an auction, but then move to more of a free market approach post-auction as people reposition themselves is something that's, I think, going to work very, very effectively in this auction, and that's an interesting lesson for the future.
The only thing I have to add, I agree with Eddie on that. There was a lot of internal debate because it's pretty clear that two things. One, entities who own multiple stations, and two, channel sharing, where we waive the prohibited communications rule, does present strategic bidding issues. We got it. We knew it. But for the reasons Eddie said, we thought whatever risks were involved were really worth it. And I think it turned out pretty well because we got a lot more participation because of it.
So since we've gone, sorry, can I?
Yeah, sure.
There, I had a couple comments. Since we went down the reserve rabbit hole a little bit, let me throw out a radical addition or alternative to a reserve, a set-aside, whatever you want to talk about it, call it. Have more spectrum at auction. There was a comment earlier about 700 and how only basically 2 bidders won spectrum. The band was set up for 2 bidders to win spectrum. That's it. If we just waited a few years and followed 700 megahertz APT, 45 megahertz of paired spectrum instead of 23, 4 bidders can win spectrum. Different auction. Something that Preston said that really struck me. It's one of the given the way that in the U.S. we structure auctions, and given the way bidders bid in them, flexibility is really important. Preston mentioned the activity rule, and he wanted bidders to be subject to placing more of their cards on the table. If you do that in this auction, possibly the single most important thing that occurred in this auction, T-Mobile having flexibility to pick up an extra unit in Los Angeles, doesn't happen. Stage 4 fails. Stage 5 fails. We go to stage 6. Suddenly broadcasters aren't getting $10 billion. So be careful what you wish for, because you might get it.
CTIA.
I would just
If
ask.
you can just say your name first.
Oh, sorry, it's Eric Stewart at Entrevision. And Gary, I just would ask, if you had a magic wand and you could have changed one thing to make the process more better, for lack of a better phrase.
I would have tried to find some way to speed it up. I do. I think it took an awfully long time. The trade-offs were a little bit more complicated than was said before. There were ways potentially to skip skip particular clearing targets, but that had to be a commission decision. It couldn't be a decision by the staff. It really wasn't set beforehand. Explaining the idea and getting commission they're smarter. They're certainly more than smart enough, but getting buy-in on an efficiency mechanism for skipping bands, I think, would have been difficult. But it would have been nice to be able to get out of the war room before 366 days.
So just one thing on the speed up from a bidder perspective, I think the FCC had a great innovation, which was intra-round bid. The bidding where you could bid not the full bid price, and that was put in place so that they could have big bid increments. And they didn't do that at the start. I think you should start with bigger bid increments and then slowly ratchet back as opposed to going the other direction. That big bid increments would have sped it up when you're well below the likely closing price. And therefore, because you have the intra-round bidding ability, you risk a lot less than you did in the regular SMR auction. So I think this was a great innovation. It could have been used to speed the auction a lot on the forward auction side.
Despite the fact that today we went from 5 to 10%, AT&T dropped its demand by
I don't think that had to do
neither
with the
do
bid
I.
increment. Alan?
I have a question.
Neither do I.
My lips are sealed.
So, but on that point, you're talking about going from a 58-round auction to maybe a 40-round auction when you're really talking about 6 weeks between stages. So this is like a third-order effect. And, the inter-round bidding added a fair amount of complexity in figuring out, especially simpler inter-round bidding, just naming price exit bids per product might have been a little bit more manageable than trying to make it better, but actually made it harder.
One of the things, and I will try to stop saying they did, in order to, because this was a unique auction, there was an awful lot of tutorials and training and workshops. If this were done another time, I think probably at least 2 months could be taken out of it, because we were cautious, they were cautious in making sure that there was sufficient bidder education.
Yeah, I do want to address the bid increment issue because it actually is important, and it's particularly important given geographic licensing. Because of the percentage increment, 5% is much different in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco than it is in St. Louis or any smaller market. And it's those major markets that are driving revenues, they're driving competition, and they drive the result. So if you start things off given this auction design, not the old SMR auction design, but given this auction design with 10%, 20%, and you have geographic licensing, and you don't have combinatorial bidding, you're asking bidders to really go out on a limb. And if there's one thing that I can say about what participants in an auction don't like, it's huge unknown risks and uncertainty.
But
10%, you're trying to get a little squirrel to come to you here. You don't want to make any big motions to scare them off.
10% of the early rounds is a lot less than 10% in the later rounds, and even 5% in the later rounds. So that was just, it's when you're well below it, then start it fast as opposed to ending it fast.
I think Eddie wants to jump in, and then we have questions from the audience.
Well, I actually had a question for the auction design, the experts, which has to do with the revealing of the total price figure, whatever, 86 billion rather, and then ratcheting down. When you have a situation where the bidders on the reverse side are, the main bidders are fairly few in number. On the broadcaster side, it's true that it's possible to, in the channel sharing world, you're trying to figure out strategically what to do and all the rest of that. But at the same time, there are a ton of you, and there's not any, whereas you can almost, there's a level of unrealism once you know that it's $86 billion. Target's not going to be hit. No incentive to ever show your cards. And that really was true probably for every round except the last round. And so I'm curious whether there's some way to do that side of the auction that doesn't involve the same level of transparency that might have driven more demand. I'm just curious about this.
So So I think, I think that it's, I'll speak, but the other people, Ilya probably would be better.
Ilya, jump in after you.
On the forward side, you had to reveal you were committed to your bid, so you had to make bids, and you had to, if you wanted to keep up eligibility, you might think that, hey, I'm going to bid in someplace else because I know it's going to go from 10 to 9. It's not going to go. It's going to go from 10 to 9, and I'm going to be able to get out. But there was a way you were at serious risk of not being the one chosen to get out. So there was definitely serious commitment on the part of forward bidders to place bids in this auction, even knowing that it wasn't going to clear. Your bids were still there for the next stage and the next stage. You were locked in. So I think there was a serious commitment on that piece.
Is there anything you want to add, Ilya?
I don't know about, on the forward side, I would think it would, I don't think it would affect bidders so much on the forward side because of this commitment issue. On the reverse side, I think it was useful information, and actually next time I would think even about revealing more information to the reverse auction bidders, because I think it does affect maybe your value. You know better than me, but I would think it would affect your valuation of the station if you know how much TV, how many channels remain on the air. And so...
Not really. The main, look, most of the money in broadcasting is swept up by maybe half a dozen stations in a market. It's not really, those are people who were not going to go off the air. They were only going to channel share, by and large, unless they own 2 in the market in which they would channel share with themselves. The whole point, I think, was to force people who have low revenue and low EBITDA to evaluate their profitability and throw in. And so I don't know that it would have, I think basically on the broadcaster side, and again, this has to do with the business environment in which people operate. Leave aside efficiency and the design of the auction. When numbers get thrown around, very, very large numbers get thrown around, investors expect you to make certain declarations as to the value of your spectrum. Your senior management expects you to commit to certain values for your spectrum, and you're under a tremendous pressure to do that in a way that's unrealistic. And I think a lot of people went to their boards and said things that were not based in reality. And I think that creates that's a disconnect between the FCC and maybe the economist community and the business community as to how these things really need to work, because it played havoc with a lot of companies. And when 86 billion comes out, people didn't go, oh, that'll never close. People went, oh my God, I'm going to make $3 billion in this auction, and that's not a particularly good dynamic.
It was a pretty happy day.
Yeah. Let me just one other thing on our bidding strategy. If we hadn't known what the clearing target was, you can look at what T-Mobile did. T-Mobile moved into LA, and that caused the auction to pass the targets. If we hadn't known about that we were past the final stage rule, we might not have done it at that point in time, and it might not have ever cleared. So knowing that was important to us.
Wait. I've got a whole lot of people who are dying to follow. Gary, do you want to follow?
I'll just say one thing.
I'll go Ilya and Larry and Charlotte, and then we'll have the question.
We usually assume that if we give people more information, then that helps them make more realistic predictions. But I guess it's not always true.
All right, so Larry wants to respond, and then we'll go to the question.
Just want to say a little bit more on auction design. So first of all, the decision how much information to give in the forward auction was quite carefully considered. I think the consensus, both in the US and internationally, is you want to give bidders in the forward auction maximal information subject to not giving disaggregated information about who opponents are or how much they're bidding for, because that facilitates collusion. And so that's the other thing actually I want to say in response to what Greg said. I'm glad you really liked inter-round bidding. It was actually not an FCC innovation except to use them in spectrum auctions. We've used them in approximately 200 energy and resource auctions before that. But I think they worked really well, and David is the only person we've heard saying that simply they were too complex and we should have used concrete licenses instead.
All right, so Jonathan here, and then a question back there. Just if you can pass the microphone straight. There we go. Bingo. And just identify yourself first.
Hi, Jonathan Cohen with Wilkinson Barker Nauer. Except for Gary, I think everybody on the panel was involved with a bidder, at least one. And I was just curious as to your assessment on the psychology of bidders given the length of time and the amount of time between stages. And how might it have been different if things had been done either with a sealed bid or at a much more accelerated pace?
I'm trained in economics, not psychology, sorry.
Yeah, I think, well, other auctions been long too. So the one difference here is you had these big breaks between stages, so everybody just disappeared for 6 weeks and then came back more or less. So I'm not sure it had quite the same effect that you think a long auction would have.
Mark Fratrick again with BIA Kelsey. We've been talking about the length of time of the forward auction and the intra-round bidding, et cetera, but I would like to focus more on the reverse auction and whether or not that could have been sped up, because there were some economic costs in the industry from the length of time, the quiet period, the 366 days. And I wonder whether or not anybody has calculated of the 366 days, how many were reverse auction days and how many were forward auction days. I suspect that the reverse auction might have been 2 to 1 of that or something like that. And
Well, since stages 2 and 3 close in a day, then I think you're right. I think there was more. I think one of the commission's concern were forward auction bidders had bid a lot in auctions before. Reverse auction bidders hadn't, and we were very concerned about a really simple, we wanted them to have the best chance at making the best evaluation and to make it as easy as possible to do. We could have sped up the number of rounds in a day. It's also and Sasha will correct my almost inevitable error, and the feasibility checker that we used was a wonderful machine, as Larry said. It was fast and quick, but we had to process all of those bids in the reverse auction, and that took us a certain amount of time to do.
I would just wonder if in stage 2, 3, and 4, since they became sophisticated bidders by then, whether or not that could have happened pending Sasha's needs.
So there run two-sided auctions in other industries, and there are constraints. Like I remember I've worked a lot on sequential auctions. There's a lot of discussion: forward should go first, or reverse should go first. I always thought they should go in parallel. There are other ways to do this that add complexity to design or might have pushback from bidders, and could have speeded it up. So they had to restart the reverse auction. They had to run each stage of the reverse auction 51 rounds roughly, because some stations would have frozen at the beginning of each stage. So as long as you sort of don't make bidders who aren't needed to reduce their price and get offers in a stage, it's going to take a long time to do the next stage.
All right. In the interest in keeping the trains running on time, we should thank the panelists for a great panel.
Good luck on closing the deal. Thank you.
And then we'll reconvene for the panel that puts it all together, so all your big picture questions for our last panel.
That was a nice